Henry Whitmore didn't even look at his daughter when he shoved her into the center of the square. He looked at the crowd. "She's been nothing but a burden since her husband threw her out," he announced, loud enough for every man, woman, and child pressed into the Red Hollow market to hear. "Barren! Useless! I'm done feeding a woman who can't earn her keep." Clara stumbled on the uneven dirt. She caught herself before she fell, but barely. 23 years old, and her own father was standing 10 feet away from her like she was a mule he'd finally decided to unload before winter. "Any man with coin," Henry continued, sweeping his arm across the crowd like he was offering up a damaged piece of furniture, "can take her off my hands today." The silence that followed was the worst sound Clara had ever heard. Not because the crowd was horrified, because they weren't. If this moment hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever been made to feel like you were worth nothing by someone who should have loved you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next in Red Hollow will change everything you think you know about worth and belonging and what it means to be chosen. The morning had started the way most mornings did in Red Hollow, with dust and noise and the smell of horses and unwashed men crowding into the square for market day. Clara had woken before sunrise, same as always. She'd swept the floor of her father's house, started the fire, heated the water, and set out the bread that was 2 days old but still edible if you didn't think too hard about it. She'd done all of it quietly, the way she did everything now, quietly and carefully, like a woman who had learned that taking up space was a luxury she could no longer afford. She hadn't always been like that. There was a version of Clara Whitmore that existed before the marriage to Daniel Pratt, before the 2 years of failed pregnancies, before the whispers that followed her through town like a second shadow, before Daniel sat across from her at their kitchen table and told her, in a voice emptied of everything, that he wanted a real wife. One who could give him children, one who was worth the trouble. That version of Clara had laughed easily, had opinions, had walked into a room without checking first whether she was allowed to be there. She barely remembered her now. What she remembered was the look on Daniel's face when she'd asked him what she was supposed to do, where she was supposed to go, and the way he'd shrugged, like the answer was so obvious it wasn't worth saying out loud. Her father had taken her back. Not out of love. Henry Whitmore didn't traffic in love. Not with his children. Not with anyone. He'd taken her back because it was what you did, and because he'd believed at first that having her around the house again might be useful. Someone to cook. Someone to mend. Someone to run errands he didn't feel like running himself. But Henry had a gambling problem that had gotten worse over the past year, and a temper that had always been bad, and a mind that worked in the particular way of men who are always looking for someone else to blame for the consequences of their own choices. By October, he owed more money than the house was worth. By November, he had started looking at Clara the way he looked at everything else he owned, calculating value, calculating what he could get. She hadn't known, that morning, what he was planning. She'd been carrying the water bucket back from the well when he told her to put on her good dress. She'd asked why. He told her to stop asking questions. She'd learned, a long time ago, that arguing with Henry when his eyes had that flat look in them was not something a person did without consequence. So she'd put on the dress. She'd followed him into town. She hadn't understood until he pushed her. The shove wasn't hard enough to knock her down. That was somehow the worst part of it. It was the casual kind of shove. The kind you gave a piece of furniture you were repositioning, not a person you were discarding. And then he turned to the crowd and started talking. And Clara had stood there in the dirt in her good dress with the water stain at the hem that she'd never been able to get fully out, and understood that this was what her life had been reduced to. A transaction. A problem to be solved with enough coin. She didn't cry. She thought about it. Felt the pressure behind her eyes that meant crying was close, but she looked at the faces watching her and made a decision. The way you make decisions when you have no good options, and the only thing left you can control is whether or not you give them what they want. She wasn't going to cry in front of these people. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to look at her father and ask him to take it back, because she already knew he wouldn't, and she couldn't stand the thought of asking and having him look at her the way he was looking at her now, like she was already gone. So she stood. She put her shoulders back. She kept her eyes forward. She let the noise of the crowd wash over her, and she stood in the middle of that square, and she did not move. A few men in the crowd were already laughing. She recognized some of them. Recognized the wives standing slightly apart, some with their mouths pressed thin in what might have been disapproval, others just watching with the blank curiosity people bring to accidents on the road. She saw Martha Cawley from the dry goods store whisper something to the woman beside her and glance at Clara and look away. She saw the preacher's wife staring at the ground. Nobody stepped forward to say it was wrong. That was when she understood, fully, what Red Hollow thought of her. Barren, they'd called her. It had started as a whisper, the way things always start in small towns, and then grown into the kind of word that attached itself to a person and became the first thing anyone thought of when they heard her name. Clara Whitmore. Barren. As though her entire self could be reduced to a single failure, a single thing she couldn't produce, a single way she'd fallen short of what she was supposed to be. She hadn't chosen it. She hadn't done anything wrong. The pregnancies had come and gone like weather, present and then violently absent, leaving nothing behind but grief that she'd had to carry alone because Daniel didn't believe in mourning things that hadn't lived long enough to be real. She'd buried that grief so deep and so thoroughly that sometimes she wasn't sure it was grief anymore. Maybe it had become something else, something harder. She was thinking about this, but standing in the square thinking about grief and hardness and the preacher's wife who couldn't look at her, when she heard the boots, not shuffling the way most of the crowd moved, deliberate, someone walking with purpose through the circle that had formed around her, and walking toward her rather than away. She turned her head. He was taller than most of the men in Red Hollow, though not in the way that called attention to itself. Lean, the way men get who work outdoors through all 4 seasons and never have quite enough of anything. His coat was decent but old, the elbows worn pale. He had a hat that had seen better years and boots that were caked with the particular combination of mud and manure that meant he'd ridden in from somewhere rather than walking over from the other side of town. Clara didn't know him. She was almost certain she'd never seen him before in her life. He stopped in front of her and looked at her, not the way the other men had looked, which was evaluating, sizing up, assessing value the same way Henry had, but just looked, like he was seeing her, like she was a person standing in the dirt and not a piece of property with a price attached. Then he turned to her father. "How much?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that gets spoken in a flat, direct voice by a man who has already made up his mind and is only asking for the arithmetic. Henry named a number. Clara heard it the way you hear things when you're not quite all the way inside your own body, from a distance, with a kind of fuzzy disbelief at the reality of it. A number. There was a number for her. The man reached into his coat. He counted out bills, folded, and set them on the post beside Henry without looking at Clara's father again. Then he turned back to Clara. "You got anything you need to get from the house?" She stared at him. "Miss," his voice was patient, "do you have belongings? Anything you need to collect before we go?" She stopped, recalibrated. "Who are you?" "Elias Crow." He said it without ceremony, the way you say your own name when you've never thought of it as particularly interesting. "I've got a ranch about 12 miles east. I've got 5 children at home with nobody to look after them, and I'm not much of a cook." "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." "Then why?" "Because what's happening here is wrong," he said simply, and with so little heat in it that it landed differently than if he'd shouted. "And because I've got a practical problem, and you've got a worse problem, and sometimes things work out even when they start wrong." Clara looked at her father. Henry was already pocketing the money, already turning away, already finished with her in every sense of the word. He didn't look back. Not once. Not to check if she was all right, not to say anything, not even to acknowledge that the transaction had concluded. He just walked, and the crowd parted for him, and he was gone. Something broke in Clara's chest right then. She had expected it to break, had been braced for it, had been telling herself that she didn't care, that he'd already been gone for years in every way that mattered. But it broke anyway, the way old wood breaks even when you knew it was rotted through. The noise of it was silent and private and entirely her own. She turned back to Elias Crow. "I have a coat," she said. "At the house." He nodded. "We'll get it." They walked back through town together, and the crowd watched them go. And Clara kept her chin level and her eyes forward the same way she had when she'd been standing in the square. But something was different now. Some small, stubborn thing had shifted inside her, though she couldn't have named it yet. She only knew that the number of people she had left in Red Hollow who expected anything from her had just dropped to 0, and there was a kind of terrifying freedom in that. She collected her coat. She collected the small bundle of things that were hers, a change of clothes, a hairbrush, a single letter she'd written to herself during the worst of the pregnancies and never sent and never thrown away. She looked around the house she'd grown up in and felt nothing that resembled home. Maybe it had never been home. Maybe she'd just been living in a building that kept her out of the rain. She went back outside where Elias Crow was waiting with 2 horses. He gave her a leg up without being asked. Didn't comment on whether she rode well or badly, just made sure she was seated and turned his horse east and started moving. They rode for a while without talking. The prairie opened up around them, flat and brown and immense, the sky low and gray with the kind of November clouds that can't decide whether to bring rain or just threaten it. Clara had grown up near enough to this landscape that it should have felt ordinary, but there was something different about seeing it from the back of a horse with nobody waiting for her in any particular direction. The sky felt bigger. The emptiness felt different. "Why did you really do it?" she said finally. Not an accusation, just a question she needed answered. Elias rode another few seconds before answering. "I told you. You said you had children who needed looking after." "I do. But that's not all of it." Another pause. The horses moved steadily, their breath visible in the cold air. "My wife passed 3 years ago," he said. "Fever. The children were—" He stopped, started again. "The youngest was 4. My daughter hadn't turned 3 yet." He kept his eyes on the horizon. "I've been managing, but managing isn't the same as living, and I could see what was happening to them, what keeps happening to them." He paused once more. "I've ridden into Red Hollow for supplies 4 times in the past year. I've seen you there each time." Clara was quiet. "I saw what they said about you," he continued, "what they called you. I saw the way you carried it." He glanced at her briefly, then away. "You never looked down. I noticed that." She didn't know what to do with that. She wasn't used to being noticed, and even less used to being noticed for something that wasn't a failure. "I might be terrible with the children," she said. "You might," he agreed. "I'm willing to find out. I might be terrible at cooking." "That's almost certainly true, based on nothing," he said, and his voice had something in it, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "I'm not much better." Clara looked at the road ahead, at the gray sky and the flat land and the 12 miles between her and whatever came next. "Crow," she said. If this doesn't work, then it doesn't work," he said, "and we figure out what happens after that. But it won't be worse than what was happening back there." She supposed that was true. She supposed that was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 2 years. They rode on into the cold, and the town of Red Hollow fell away behind them. And Clara Whitmore, sold, discarded, reduced to a number on a Tuesday morning in November, looked at the flat and empty land ahead of her and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Not happiness, not safety, just the raw and bewildering sensation of possibility. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the afternoon light started to thin. A low, solid house with smoke from the chimney, a barn in decent repair, fencing that needed work but was standing, a dog that came running from somewhere and barked twice at Clara's horse and then seemed to lose interest, and 5 children standing in front of the house. She could see them from the road. The oldest, a boy of maybe 13 or 14, with his arms crossed and an expression that had already decided it didn't like what it was seeing. 2 younger boys behind him, watching with open curiosity. A boy who looked about 8, hanging back slightly, something careful in his posture. And a girl, small enough that Clara's first thought was that she must be the 4-year-old, but something in the way she stood, or rather didn't stand, the way she pressed herself behind the second boy and watched from that shelter, suggested she was older than her size. None of them moved. None of them smiled. The oldest one looked at Clara the way a man 3 times his age might look at someone he suspected was about to take something from him. Clara looked back at him. She didn't smile either. She'd learned that children who expected things from smiles were not children who could be won by them. She climbed down from the horse herself, not gracefully. Her foot caught slightly, and she stumbled on landing and had to catch herself on the saddle, and stood in the dirt and looked at the 5 of them looking at her. "I'm Clara," she said. The oldest boy said nothing. One of the middle boys said, "Do you know how to make biscuits?" "Samuel," Elias said from behind her. "No," the boy said, unapologetic. "She's going to be cooking for us. It's a fair question." Clara looked at him. He was maybe 10, with his father's directness and none of the social awareness that usually got layered over directness as people aged. "I can learn," she said. "Pa's biscuits are terrible," he confided. "I am standing right here," Elias said. I know, Samuel said. They're still terrible. And that small, absurd exchange, the most normal thing that had happened to Clara in months, cracked something open. Not much, just a hairline fracture in the armor she'd been wearing since morning. She felt it and quickly pressed it closed. But it had happened. She was here. She was still standing. And somewhere inside the walls of that low, solid house, with its smoke and its bickering and its 5 children who didn't know her yet, something was waiting that Clara Whitmore hadn't had in a very long time. A chance. The first night, Clara slept on a narrow cot in the corner of the kitchen, which was the only space available that wasn't already occupied by a child or a memory of one. Elias had shown her the room without apology, just opened the door, said the blankets were in the chest, and left her to it. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Wind through gaps in the siding. One of the boys coughing once, then going quiet. The dog scratching at the outside of the back door, and then giving up. She stared at the ceiling and tried to take stock of what she knew. She knew she was 12 miles from a town that had watched her father sell her that morning and done nothing. She knew she was in a stranger's house, in a stranger's kitchen, with 5 children who had looked at her with varying degrees of suspicion and open evaluation. She knew that the oldest boy, she'd learned his name was Thomas, had not said a single word to her from the moment she arrived to the moment Elias sent them all to bed. He'd just watched with that particular quality of watchfulness that belongs to children who have learned that new things in their lives are usually the beginning of new losses. She knew she was 37 cents from having nothing at all. She'd counted in the dark, the coins she kept in the small cloth pouch at the bottom of her bundle. 37 cents and a change of clothes and a hairbrush and a letter she'd never sent. She tried to think practically. She was good at that when everything else failed, the narrowing down to what was true and concrete and actionable. She was warm. She was fed. Elias had put a plate in front of her at supper without ceremony, and the food had been simple and not quite hot enough, but she'd eaten every bite. Nobody here wanted anything from her tonight. Tomorrow would ask things of her, but tonight nobody wanted anything. She fell asleep before she'd finished cataloging what she had. Morning came in through a crack in the wall above the cot, and before Clara had fully decided to be awake, there was noise. The boys didn't have a quiet gear. Thomas moved through the house with the deliberate heaviness of someone performing adulthood, opening and closing things with more force than necessary. The 2 middle boys, Samuel, who had asked about biscuits, and a 9-year-old named Peter, were arguing about something that seemed to involve a boot and a certain amount of blame for its disappearance. The 8-year-old, whose name she'd learned was Caleb, came to the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara with an expression of deep seriousness. "Are you making breakfast?" he asked. "I was planning to," Clara said. She was still sitting on the cot, still fully dressed because she hadn't undressed to sleep in a stranger's house. Her hair needed attention. She needed water to wash her face. She had no idea where anything in this kitchen was kept. "Pa usually makes porridge," Caleb said, "but it's lumpy. Mine might also be lumpy," she warned him. He considered this. "That's okay," he said finally, and went away. She found the oats in the 3rd cabinet she checked. The salt was where she expected it. The fire was easier to manage than the stove at her father's house, which had been temperamental since she was 12. She had the water heating before Elias came in from outside, mud on his boots, his face already carrying the particular look of a man who has been awake longer than anyone else in the building. He looked at the pot, then at her. "Porridge," she said. "Caleb tells me yours is lumpy." "Caleb talks too much," Elias said, but there was no sharpness in it. He went to wash his hands at the basin and didn't say anything else. And Clara stirred the porridge and tried to feel less like she was trespassing. The girl still hadn't spoken. That was the thing Clara couldn't stop circling back to. Her name was May, and she was 6 years old, and she'd sat through supper the night before without making a sound. Not asking for things, not complaining, not responding when Samuel leaned over and tried to get her attention. She ate what was put in front of her and kept her eyes on her bowl, and when supper was over, she'd followed her brothers to bed like a small, careful shadow. Clara asked Elias about it that first morning, quietly, while the boys were eating. When did she stop talking? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't evasion, but is more like he was finding the right container for the answer. "About a year after her mother died," he said. "She was talking fine, and then one day she wasn't. Doctor in Red Hollow said it sometimes happens with children, that she'd come back to it when she was ready." Has she shown any signs? Not yet. He looked at his coffee. She's not. She understands everything. She's sharp. She just doesn't speak. Does it scare you? He looked up at her, and she thought she might have overstepped, might have touched something too raw, too personal, too close to the center of things she hadn't earned access to yet. But he just said, "Every day," and went back to his coffee. Thomas didn't come to breakfast. She didn't ask about that either. The first week was an education in failure. Not catastrophic failure, nothing burned down, nobody was hurt, but the small, daily, grinding kind that accumulates like dust on a windowsill. Clara burned the porridge on the third morning because she was distracted by Peter and Samuel's argument about whether a particular stone in the yard constituted a throwing stone or a keeping stone, which was somehow a deeply serious philosophical dispute. She put too much salt in the beans on Wednesday. She sewed a button back on Thomas's shirt and used the wrong color thread, and he noticed immediately and said nothing, but she saw him looking at it, and somehow his silence on the matter was worse than if he'd pointed it out. The laundry. Nobody had warned her about the laundry situation, which had gotten badly behind over the past several months. 2 hours into working through the pile on Monday, Clara's hands were raw, and her back ached in a way that reminded her that she hadn't done sustained physical labor in some time, and she was kneeling over the washboard with soap in her eyes when Elias appeared in the doorway of the small lean-to where the washing was done. He took in the situation. He didn't say anything about the soap or the expression on her face, or the fact that she had managed to wet herself from elbow to shoulder on both sides. "I'll help," he said. "I'm fine." "Clara." She didn't answer. He came in anyway and picked up the other side of the sheet she was working on, and they wrestled it through the water in silence for a while. His hands were calloused in a way that showed he was used to this kind of work, which she found surprising. She'd known men who would not have touched laundry for any reason. He didn't comment on it, just worked. "Thomas won't talk to me," she said. It came out without her meaning for it to. "He's been that way since his mother passed," Elias said. "He's angry." "Yes." "Is he angry at her? For dying?" Elias was quiet. They worked the sheet through the rinse water. "He's angry at everything right now," he said. "He's 14. His mother died, and his father doesn't know what he's doing half the time, and his sister won't speak. He's keeping himself together with anger because that's the only thing he's found that works." That sounds exhausting. It is. For all of us. Clara thought about this. She thought about being 14 and holding yourself together with rage because grief was too slippery to hold on to. She thought she understood something about that, though she'd been older when she'd had to learn it. "I'm not trying to replace her," Clara said. "Their mother. I need him to know that." "He knows." "Does he?" "He will," Elias said. And that was different, and he seemed to know it, because he didn't say anything more. The moments that worked were smaller than she'd expected. Peter asked her to help him with the letters he was supposed to be learning. The territory required children to demonstrate basic literacy, and Elias had been trying to teach them himself with mixed results. And she sat with him for an hour at the kitchen table going through the alphabet with a patience she hadn't known she had. He was a quick learner, though he fidgeted constantly, could not keep his hands still, always had to be touching something while he thought. She let him hold a smooth river stone from the windowsill, and he learned 4 new letters before supper. May watched from the doorway. Clara didn't acknowledge her watching. She'd made a decision, privately, not to push, not to make eye contact at strategic moments, not to try to coax, not to offer things in a way that telegraphed wanting something in return. She just let May exist in the peripheral edges of whatever she was doing and tried to act as though this was entirely normal and required no comment. It was harder than she'd expected. There was something about the little girl, something in the careful way she moved, the way she watched the world from behind doors and corners, like she needed to assess the safety of every room before she entered it, that reached into Clara's chest and squeezed something that had been dormant for a long time. She didn't let herself look at it directly. She just kept her attention on Peter and his riverstone and his letters. Caleb was the easiest. He had the quality, rare in children, of simply accepting what was present. Clara was here. Therefore, Clara was part of the situation. He would adjust accordingly. He started showing up in the kitchen while she cooked, not to help exactly, but to narrate. He would describe what he'd been doing, what he'd observed, what questions had occurred to him during the course of the day. He asked her once why the sky was a different color at the edges in the evening than it was at the center, and she told him she didn't know, and he nodded seriously and said, "I'll think about it." as though that resolved the matter. She started to look forward to Caleb. Thomas remained a wall. It was the end of the second week when the first thing happened that mattered. She'd gone to the barn early, earlier than usual because she hadn't been able to sleep, and lying awake in the kitchen felt worse than doing something. Elias kept the barn in better order than the house, which told her something about him, though she couldn't have said exactly what. She was looking for something to occupy herself. There was mending she'd noticed needed doing on one of the horse blankets, and she'd found it hanging near the stall of the older of the two horses, a gray mare named something she didn't know yet. She was working on it by lantern light when she heard breathing that wasn't the horse's. She turned. Thomas was standing inside the barn door. He had on his coat over his nightclothes and his boots unlaced, and he was staring at her with an expression that shifted when he realized she'd seen him into the defensive blankness that was apparently his default. "Couldn't sleep," Claire said. She turned back to the mending. She did not ask him what he was doing there or suggest he should go back inside or make any indication that his presence required explanation. Silence. The mare moved in her stall. Clara pulled the needle through the blanket. "She liked the horses," Thomas said. Clara went still, kept her hands moving, but went still inside. "My mother," he added, as though she might have needed clarification. "What were her favorites?" Clara asked. She kept her voice level, matter of fact, the same voice she'd used to ask Peter about his letters. Another long pause. She thought he was going to leave. She could feel him deciding whether to leave. "The gray," he said. "She said brown horses were common. She had opinions. She had opinions about everything." A beat. Something moved across his face. She talked a lot. Like Samuel. Pa always said Samuel got it from her. Is that where he got it? Probably. Thomas came a few steps further into the barn, not close to her. He stopped near the gray's stall and looked at the horse rather than at Clara. She was good at fixing things, not sewing, practical things, fences and hinges, and she could figure out what was wrong with something just by looking at it. Clara said nothing. She let him have the air. "I don't know why he brought you here," Thomas said. The defensiveness was back, but thinner, like armor that had been wearing down from the inside. "He needed help," Clara said. "We were managing." "I know. We didn't need—" He stopped, tried again. "I can cook. I'm not good at it, but I can do it. I can manage the younger ones. I've been doing it." "I know you have," Clara said. "I can see that." She looked up at him then, because she judged the moment right. "You've been holding this whole family together, Thomas. That's not a small thing. That's an enormous thing. And you've been doing it while also being 14 years old, which isn't an age when anyone should have to hold a whole family together." His jaw moved. Something was happening behind his eyes that he was working hard to keep off his face. "I'm not here to take it from you," Clara said. "I'm not here to replace anything. I don't know what I'm here to be yet, honestly. I'm still figuring it out." She went back to the mending. "But I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not going to ask you to feel anything you don't feel." He stood there for a while longer. Then he said, "The gray's name is Agnes." "Agnes," Clara repeated. "Ma named her." "It suits her," Clara said, looking at the horse. Thomas stood with Agnes for another few minutes. Then he went back to the house. He didn't say good night, but the barn door closed quietly, which was different from the way he usually closed things. Clara went back to the mending and let out a breath she'd been holding for a very long time. The trouble with Caleb started on a Thursday, 3 weeks after her arrival, and it started small the way the worst things always do. He'd been quiet at supper. Quieter than his ordinary quiet, which was just the absence of narration rather than the presence of silence. She'd noticed and said nothing because Caleb was 8, and sometimes 8-year-olds were quiet without it meaning anything. But she'd watched him when he didn't know she was watching, and she'd seen the way he held his left side when he sat down, and the way he reached for his water with his right hand when he was ordinarily left-handed, and the careful way he breathed. She'd gone to find him after supper, when the older boys were occupied with their own things, and Elias was out checking the animals. May was in the corner of the main room with a scrap of fabric she'd been doing something with all week, folding and refolding it into different shapes, which was apparently satisfying to her in ways that were not available through language. Caleb was in the room he shared with Peter and Samuel. He was sitting on the edge of his cot looking at the floor. "Let me see," Clara said. He looked up. "See what?" "Whatever you're holding so carefully." His mouth pulled to one side, the look of a child weighing the cost of admission. Then he lifted his shirt. The bruise ran from his rib cage down his left side, dark and wide and several days along in its coloring. Not fresh. This had happened before Thursday. Who? Clara said. She kept her voice very steady. I fell, Caleb said. Caleb. Off the fence by the east pasture last week. I was trying to Caleb. She said it the same way the second time, not louder, just more fully present. He looked at her. His chin was doing something complicated that he was trying to control with the visible effort of every muscle in his face. There are boys in town, he said finally, when Pa takes us for supplies. There are boys who sometimes... He stopped. It's fine. It's the same boys who do it to Peter. They do it because we don't have a mother. They say things about us. Clara was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't acceptance. What kinds of things? She asked. He shook his head. He wasn't going to say. She didn't push. She pressed her hands carefully along the bruise to check whether anything felt wrong underneath it. She'd seen enough injuries to know the difference between a bruise that was only a bruise and one that meant more. And he winced, but didn't make a sound, which told her something about how long he'd been carrying this without telling anyone. It doesn't feel broken, she said, but you need to tell your father about this. He has enough to worry about. Caleb. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. You are not a burden. You are his son. You are allowed to need things. He blinked. She could see he was turning the sentence over, examining it for catches. He'll be angry, Caleb said. At you? At the boys. Good, Clara said. He should be. Something shifted in Caleb's face. The held-tight quality loosened slightly, like a knot that's been pulled too long in the wrong direction and finally given a small amount of slack. She helped him put his shirt back down. She went and found Elias. She told him plainly and without drama, because she'd learned already that Elias responded better to plain information than to the emotional packaging that people sometimes felt compelled to wrap it in. She told him there were boys in town. She told him what Caleb had said. She told him the bruise was old enough to have been there a week. Elias listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He didn't tell me, he said. He didn't want to add to your worry. A muscle moved in his jaw. He's 8. I know. He shouldn't be. He stopped, closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the anger was there but controlled, aimed somewhere beyond the room. I'll talk to him. Don't be too much at once, Clara said. He held it for a week. He's used to holding things alone. Don't make him feel like he did something wrong by finally letting someone see it. Elias looked at her. It was the first time she realized that she'd told him how to handle one of his own children. She hadn't meant to. She'd overstepped and she knew it, and she was opening her mouth to say so when he said, You're right. She closed her mouth. You're right, he said again, and went to find Caleb. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the muffled sound of Elias's voice from the other room, low and steady, and without any of the sharpness she'd half expected, and felt something complicated happen in her chest. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something older and more cautious than happiness. Something that had learned to come sideways because it had been burned too many times coming at things directly. She went back to the dishes and told herself not to name it. It was another week before May did anything that Clara could call deliberate contact. The girl still hadn't spoken. Not a word, not even an involuntary sound that she was aware of, but she'd started turning up near Clara with slightly less distance between them. She'd been in the kitchen more. She'd watched the cooking from a stool near the window rather than from the doorway. Small concessions, small adjustments, the territorial mapping of a child who was still deciding whether trust was survivable. Then one afternoon, Clara was working on the button situation. There was always a button situation in a house with 4 boys. And her needle slipped and she pricked her finger and said something under her breath that wasn't suitable for children, and looked up to find May standing 2 feet away looking at her with enormous, serious eyes. I'm fine, Clara said. May reached out and touched Clara's hand. Just that. Just a small, careful hand closing briefly around Clara's fingers, and then withdrawing. Clara looked at her. May looked back. Thank you, Clara said. May nodded once, solemnly, and went back to her corner with the scrap of fabric. Clara sat with the needle in her hand for a long moment. She did not cry, because she was in the middle of the kitchen, and there were children in the house, and she was not going to cry in the middle of the kitchen, but she allowed herself 30 seconds of looking at the spot where May had stood, and she counted those seconds carefully, and when she got to 30, she picked up the button and went back to work. The nights were the hardest, not because of the cot, which she'd grown almost used to, but because nights were when the stillness came in, and the stillness brought everything she'd been keeping herself too busy to think about. Her father, the square, the number he'd named, the way the crowd had watched, the way she'd stood in her good dress with the water stain at the hem and told herself not to beg. She thought about those things in the dark, and tried to hold them at arm's length, tried to examine them with the same practical steadiness she tried to bring to everything else. But there were nights when they came too close, and she lay on the cot and felt the weight of them pressing down. And the question that came with the weight was always the same. What did it mean about her that she was here? Not in a self-pitying way, genuinely. What did it mean that the people who were supposed to want her hadn't, and the person who had taken her in had done it for practical reasons? And the closest thing she had to a life was a cot in a stranger's kitchen and 5 children who still didn't know what to make of her. She didn't answer the question. She'd learned that some questions weren't for answering in the dark. But one night in early December, when the cold had settled in properly and the wind off the plains had teeth in it, she woke up and the house was different. Not quiet. Quiet was its normal state at this hour, but alert in the way a house gets when something is wrong. She sat up. From the room where May slept alone, because she'd started sleeping alone after her mother died and Elias hadn't known how to change it, there was a sound. Clara was out of the cot before she'd fully made the decision to move. She went to the door of May's room and opened it. The girl was burning. Clara could see it from the doorway. The flush, the way her breathing had gone wrong. The small body curled in on itself under blankets that should have been keeping her warm but weren't doing the job. She crossed the room and put her hand on May's forehead and felt the heat that meant something had been going wrong for a while. The kind of fever that doesn't announce itself until it's already built into something serious. She moved fast. She went for Elias first, woke him with a hand on his shoulder and 3 words, "May is sick." And by the time he was fully awake and moving, she was already back in May's room with the basin and cool water and cloths. She worked the way she'd learned to work in the middle of the night during the worst of her own losses. Methodically, without panic, because panic was expensive and she couldn't afford it. Elias came in behind her and stood at the foot of the bed, and his face had gone a terrible color. She knew what he was thinking. She knew without having to be told. A man who had already lost a wife to fever was standing at the foot of his daughter's bed, watching it happen again, and every atom of him was fighting the impulse to go blank with terror. "I need you present," Clara said. She said it without looking up from what she was doing. "I need you here with me, not somewhere else. Can you do that?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "Good. Get more water from the kitchen, cold as it gets, and bring the lamp." He went. She stayed through the night. The boys woke one by one. It was impossible, with the movement and the lamp and the sounds, for them to sleep through it entirely. And Thomas came to the doorway and looked in, and something happened in his face when he saw Clara on her knees beside his sister's bed that she couldn't quite read, and she didn't have time to read it because she was busy. She talked to May through the night, not constantly, not a stream of anxious chatter, but steadily, the way you talk to someone when you need them to know you're still there. She said ordinary things. She said she'd burned the porridge again this morning, and Caleb had been very polite about it. But Samuel hadn't been polite at all. She said Agnes, the horse, had looked at her in a way this morning that suggested the horse had opinions. She said she'd found a crack in the east wall of the kitchen that she was planning to fix with the good clay if the cold didn't come in too hard first. She talked, and she kept the cloths cool and the water moving, and she watched May's breathing and counted the intervals between, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning, the absolute darkest part, the part when everything feels most possible and most wrong simultaneously, the fever broke. It didn't break dramatically. Fevers never did, in Clara's experience. They broke quietly, in the sweat-soaked sheets and the slower breathing and the slight loosening of the body's fight. She felt it before she could see it, and then she saw it. And then she sat back on her heels and let out the breath she'd been rationing for the past several hours. Elias was on the other side of the bed. He'd been there for most of the night, doing what she told him to do, not getting in her way, occasionally getting in her way and then adjusting without comment. He was looking at his daughter, and his face had something in it that Clara had never seen on him before. Relief, yes, but something else under it. something that looked for just a moment before he put it away, like he was seeing Clara clearly for the first time. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They sat in the quiet of the room and listened to May breathing normally, and the night pressed in around the house. And somewhere in the barn, Agnes moved in her stall, and the fire was still going in the kitchen because Thomas, without being asked, had gone and kept it going all night. May opened her eyes just before dawn. She looked at the ceiling, then at her father, then at Clara. Clara's hand was resting near May's on the blanket, not touching, just there. May looked at the hand, then she reached out, with the slow deliberateness of someone still at the edges of sleep, and covered Clara's hand with her own. They stayed like that while the dark outside began its slow recession toward gray, and Clara kept her eyes on the girl's face, and May's breathing deepened into real sleep, and the hand on Clara's didn't loosen. May slept through most of the following day, and the house rearranged itself around her sleep the way houses do when someone in them has been frightened badly and then relieved. The boys were quieter than usual. Thomas made porridge in the morning without being asked and without burning it, which was either a new skill or concentration born of the previous night's fear. Peter and Samuel argued at half their normal volume. Caleb sat near May's door with his smooth river stone and didn't narrate anything to anyone, just sat and turned the stone over in his fingers with the particular patience of a child who has decided that being nearby is the only useful thing available to him. Elias went out to the animals because the animals still needed tending, regardless of what the night had brought, and Clara understood that he also needed the cold air and the open space and the work that asked nothing of him emotionally. She'd seen that in him already, the way outdoor labor functioned as a kind of reset, a way of returning himself to himself after something had gotten too close to the center. She understood it because she did something similar with cleaning. When things pressed in, she cleaned. She cleaned the kitchen twice that day. By evening, May was sitting up and accepting broth. She still hadn't spoken, and Clara had stopped expecting speech as a near-term possibility, had settled into the longer view of things, but she was present and clear-eyed, and she followed Clara's movements with the quiet tracking attention she always brought to observation. When Clara brought the broth, May accepted it with both hands around the bowl and looked at Clara over the rim with something that wasn't quite gratitude. Gratitude was too thin a word for it, but was in that direction. It was Thomas who said the thing that mattered. He'd come to stand in the kitchen doorway while Clara was finishing the cleanup, and he had a look on his face that she'd come to recognize. The look of someone rehearsing something, turning it over, trying to find the version that came out least exposed. "What you did last night," he said. Clara waited. You weren't." He stopped, tried again with a different starting point. "A lot of people would have woken Pa and gone back to sleep." "I wasn't sleeping anyway," Clara said. "That's not the point." "What is the point, Thomas?" He looked at the floor, 14 years old, holding a feeling he didn't have good words for yet. "You stayed," he said. "That's the point." He went back to the other room before she could respond, which was probably for the best. She didn't have a response that wouldn't have made the moment heavier than either of them wanted it to be. She put away the last dish and looked at the clean kitchen and thought about staying, about what it meant to stay. She'd been stayed with exactly once in her life. A neighbor woman, during the second of the pregnancies, who'd come and sat through the worst hours without being asked and without explaining herself. She'd never forgotten it. She'd carried it through everything that came after as evidence of something she couldn't quite articulate, that it was possible to be in a room with someone in pain and not leave. That was not as common as people believed it should be. She'd stayed for May the same way that woman had stayed for her. She hadn't made a decision about it. She'd just gotten out of bed and gone. December settled in hard. The cold that came off the plains in winter on that stretch of territory was a particular kind of cold, not sharp, but total, the kind that got into everything and didn't leave. Clara learned the drafts of the house by feel, which walls breathed cold air at what hours, which floors went icy first. She stuffed the crack in the kitchen wall with clay she'd prepared in warmer weather, and it helped more than she'd expected. She moved the children's cots away from the north-facing walls by 2 feet each, which involved negotiations with Samuel, who felt that the positioning of his cot was a matter of personal sovereignty. 2 feet, Clara said. "It's my cot," Samuel said. "It's your father's cot, technically, and the cold comes off that wall at 3 in the morning, and you've been sleeping through it, which is why you've had a runny nose for 11 days. I always have a runny nose in winter. You don't have to. Samuel looked at her with the expression of someone who suspected they were being managed and wasn't sure whether to resent it. "Fine," he said, with enormous 11-year-old dignity. 2 feet. Peter helped without complaint, which was unusual and which Clara catalogued privately as evidence that the night of May's fever had shifted something in him. He'd been the most openly watchful of her, after Thomas, watching not with Thomas's defensive suspicion, but with a kind of scientific interest, as though he was collecting data points and hadn't yet reached a conclusion. Since that night he'd been slightly different, slightly more willing to simply be in the same room. She got them all moved by evening, and that night Samuel, for the first time in 11 days, did not wake up congested. He reported this at breakfast with the air of someone presenting reluctant evidence. "Still 2 feet," Clara said. "I know," he said, and went back to his porridge. Elias watched this exchange from across the table with an expression Clara didn't look at directly. She'd noticed that she was careful about looking at Elias directly lately, which was something she was filing away in the part of her mind marked "not right now" and moving on. The trip to Red Hollow came in the second week of December, and Clara had been expecting it. Elias needed supplies, things the ranch couldn't produce, things that had to be bought, and the children needed to come along because they'd been cooped up for weeks, and the particular cabin fever of children in winter had been manifesting in ways that were creative and not entirely welcome. Samuel had taken to building structural experiments out of anything he could find and testing them by jumping on them. Peter had reorganized the barn in a way that made complete logical sense, but left Elias unable to find anything for 3 days. Thomas had split more firewood than they could reasonably use before spring, which at least had practical value even if it was obviously displacement. They went on a clear Tuesday morning with both horses and the small wagon. Clara sat in the wagon bed with the younger children. May sat beside her, pressed against her side, with the particular unremarked-upon quality of a child who has decided that proximity is acceptable without the need to announce it. Clara kept still and let the warmth of the small body against her arm exist without comment. The town came up on them faster than she'd remembered. She'd told herself she was ready. She'd been telling herself that for 2 weeks, turning it over during the cleaning, during the late nights, during the quiet mornings. She had made herself practice the particular kind of steadiness that comes not from not feeling things, but from feeling them completely enough that they lose the power to surprise you. She knew what was in Red Hollow. She knew what faces it wore, and what voices they spoke with, and what they thought of her. She thought she was ready. She wasn't, quite. The first person to see her was Martha Colley from the dry goods store, and the look on Martha's face moved through recognition, calculation, and settled on a particular kind of smile. Not warm, not cold, but the smile of someone who wants you to know that they remember something, and have not forgotten, and are not going to pretend otherwise. "Clara Whitmore," Martha said. "Or is it Crow now?" "Whitmore," Clara said. She kept her voice level. "Still." Martha let the word land where it wanted to land. "I heard you'd come out to Elias Crow's place. How's that working out for you?" "Fine," Clara said. "He's a decent enough man." Martha glanced at Elias, who had already moved toward the hardware, which might have been deliberate or might simply have been Elias. Strange choice, taking in a woman who couldn't... She stopped, looked at May beside Clara. "Well, children everywhere, I suppose." Clara said nothing. Martha's smile tightened slightly, the way smiles do when the response they're designed to provoke doesn't come. "You look well," she said, which was the social version of retreat, and went back into her store. Clara stood on the planked walk outside and breathed through her nose until the sharp edge of the moment passed. May was looking up at her. Clara looked down. May's face asked a question that didn't require words. "I'm all right," Clara said. "She's just someone who has more interest in other people's lives than her own." May considered this and seemed to find it satisfactory. The rest of the morning passed with the particular texture of a public outing that is neither disaster nor comfort. People saw her and reacted, some with the careful neutrality of people who hadn't made up their minds, some with the particular Red Hollow brand of social temperature-taking that involved being pleasant on the surface while transmitting disapproval in every other register. A woman she didn't know well said something to her companion behind a hand as she passed, and Clara heard the word she always heard, and felt it land the way it always landed, and kept walking. The boys ran into trouble near the feed store. She heard it before she saw it. Raised voices, the specific sharp quality of teenage confrontation. She rounded the corner with May's hand in hers, and found Peter backed against the wall of the feed store, and 2 boys a year or two older standing close to him with the posture that means only one thing, and Samuel 3 feet behind them with his fists at his sides, clearly trying to decide what to do, and Thomas arriving from the other direction, taking in the scene. The larger of the 2 boys was saying something to Peter that Clara didn't hear fully, but caught the shape of something about mothers, something about charity cases. The kind of words that boys that age use when they want to do damage but maintain the plausible deniability of it being just words. Peter wasn't crying, his jaw was set and his eyes were overbright, but he wasn't crying and he wasn't backing down, which Clara understood was worse for the 2 boys than if he had been, because they wanted a reaction and weren't getting one. Thomas stepped forward. He was taller than both of the boys by a little, and the particular anger he carried, the compressed and controlled kind, gave him a quality of weight that wasn't about size. "Move," Thomas said. "We're talking to your brother." "You're done talking to my brother." The larger boy measured Thomas and seemed to find the math uncertain. He looked at his companion. Some communication passed between them that couldn't be heard, only read in the slight shift of posture and the decision that playing this out wasn't worth the outcome. They left. Not running. They were too old to run, but moving with the deliberate casualness of people making sure the retreat doesn't look like a retreat. Peter's jaw unlocked. He breathed. Thomas stood with his back to Clara for a moment, and she could see the tension still in his shoulders, the anger still needing somewhere to go. Then he turned around and saw her and May standing at the edge of the scene, and something in his face adjusted. "Those are the boys," he said, "the ones who hurt Caleb." "I know," Clara said. "Somebody should say something to their families." "Yes," Clara said. "Somebody should." Thomas looked at her, looked at Elias, who had appeared from the hardware store carrying a length of chain and had the look of a man taking stock of a situation he'd arrived at the tail end of. "What happened?" Elias said. Thomas told him. Plainly, without embellishment, the way Clara had noticed Thomas communicated things when he was past the point of managing his own anger and just needed to move information from one place to another. Elias listened. He set down the chain on the wagon bed carefully and looked in the direction the 2 boys had gone, and the look on his face was the quiet kind of anger, not explosive, not performative, but the kind that goes down to bedrock and stays. "I'll find their fathers," he said. "Elias." This was Clara. He looked at her. "Do it right," she said. "Not in the street, not with the whole town watching. Find them privately. Tell them plainly. Men respond better when they don't have an audience to perform for." He looked at her for a moment, the same way he'd looked at her in May's room, the morning after the fever broke, like he was recalibrating something. "You're right," he said. It was the second time he'd said that to her, and the second time she hadn't known entirely what to do with it. It was Cole Mercer who made the day turn dangerous. She'd seen Mercer in passing before. Not met him, but seen him, the way you see certain people in a small territory without ever intersecting. He owned land 3 miles south of Elias's ranch, or claimed to own it. She'd heard something from Peter about a water rights dispute that predated her arrival, something Elias had mentioned once in passing, and then didn't bring up again. Mercer was the kind of man who took up more space than he occupied, loud in the particular way of men who believe loudness is a form of authority, with the ease of someone who had never had to adjust himself for anyone. He came around the corner of the general store while Clara was loading sacks into the wagon. The children were elsewhere. Elias had taken the boys to find the fathers of the 2 who'd confronted Peter, and May was inside the general store with Mrs. Patterson, who was one of the few people in Red Hollow who'd greeted Clara without the undercurrent of calculation. Mercer stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way certain men look at women, not as people, but as categories, as situations. She'd been looked at that way enough times to know the exact quality of it. "You're Crow's woman," he said. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. She kept loading. "Right." He moved closer. Not close enough to be indisputable, but close enough that she could feel the intention of it, the testing of whether she'd step back. "Heard about the arrangement. Crow paying for a woman because he couldn't find one willing." "You heard wrong," Clara said. "Did I?" It wasn't a question. He was watching her hands on the sacks with the particular attention of someone trying to find something to use. "You know what I heard about you before that? From your husband." She stopped. "Daniel Pratt's a friend of mine," Mercer said, and he smiled when he said it because he'd seen her stop, and that was what he'd been fishing for. "Small territory, men talk." He let that sit for a moment. Can't say he spoke well of you. She turned and looked at him. Not with the anger he was trying to provoke, she understood now what he wanted. The same thing the boys had wanted from Peter, the reaction that confirmed the power dynamic. But with the steadiness she'd been practicing for 2 weeks, and had apparently gotten better at than she'd realized. I imagine he didn't, she said. Men who leave their wives rarely speak well of them afterward. It would require acknowledging too much about themselves. Something moved in Mercer's face. Recalculation. He stepped closer. Now the distance was indisputable, and she felt the physical reality of it, the size of him, the deliberate encroachment. And underneath the steadiness, something older and colder kicked in, the instinct that recognized danger before the mind had finished assessing it. She held her ground. You're on Crow's land arrangement now, Mercer said, lower. And Crow's got a water problem he doesn't fully understand yet. When he does understand it, he's going to need friends. He let the pause extend. Or he's going to need to be smart about who he makes enemies of. Are you threatening my family's water supply? Clara said. She said it loudly enough that it carried. Mercer's eyes went flat. I'm having a conversation, he said. In my experience, Clara said at the same volume, men who need to remind women of their size during a conversation aren't having a conversation. They're doing something else and calling it one. A woman on the walk across the street had stopped moving. An older man coming out of the feed store had paused. Mercer was aware of them. She could see him becoming aware, the calibration happening behind his eyes, the cost-benefit of how this looked against whatever he'd planned to accomplish. He stepped back. Careful, Miss Whitmore, he said. Quiet now. Private. Things out here can go sideways fast for people who don't know where they stand. He walked away. Clara stood by the wagon and waited for her hands to stop their slight trembling, which took longer than she would have liked. She picked up the next sack and kept moving. Elias appeared 10 minutes later. He'd dealt with the fathers. She could tell by the particular look he carried, the one of a man who had said something difficult and said it well and wasn't going to talk about it unless asked. He looked at Clara, and then he looked at the wagon, reading something in the way she was moving. What happened? He said. I had a conversation with Cole Mercer. He went still. He was making a point, Clara said, about water and friends, and the wisdom of knowing where you stand. Elias's jaw worked. Did he touch you? No. Did he? Elias. She turned to look at him. He was testing what kind of threat I was. I held my ground. He recalculated and left. It's done. It's not done, Elias said. Not permanently, she agreed, but for today. He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read everything in the look. There were layers in it she wasn't going to assume she understood. Then he said, The water issue is real. He's been diverting from the creek that feeds our south pasture. I've been watching it and haven't had enough proof to take anywhere. Then we need proof, Clara said. We. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything about the word she'd chosen, which had come out before she'd made a decision about it. Start documenting it, she said. Write down every date you notice the water lower than it should be. Every time the flow changes. Get specific. Measurements, if you can manage it, or descriptions detailed enough that they can't be argued with. She turned back to the wagon. You can't fight a man like Mercer with anger. He's counting on anger. You fight him with a record. The ride home was quieter than the ride in. The boys were subdued in the particular way of boys who have been in or near a confrontation and are still metabolizing it. May had fallen asleep against Clara's arm. The wagon moved through the cold afternoon and the land spread out around them, flat and enormous and indifferent to the specific human complications happening on its surface. Samuel, after a long silence, said, Those boys called us charity cases. I know, Clara said. We're not charity cases. No, Clara said. You're not. Thomas almost hit one of them. I know. Would that have been bad? Clara thought about this honestly. It would have felt good for about 5 seconds, she said, and then it would have given them something to say about your family for the next year. So, yes, bad. Samuel considered. Thomas knew that. Thomas is smarter than he lets on. A pause. Are you going to stay? Samuel asked. He said it with the directness of someone who has been thinking about it for a while and decided to stop thinking and just ask. Clara looked at him. He was watching her with the same open-faced curiosity he brought to everything, the quality that made him both exhausting and, she'd found, one of the clearest windows into what was actually happening in the family. "Yes," she said. "Even though people here are mean to you?" "People are mean to me in ways that tell me more about them than about me," Claire said. "That's not a good reason to go anywhere." Samuel absorbed this. "Ma used to say something like that," he said. "Not the same words, but something like that." Clara didn't respond. She didn't feel she was in a position to respond, but she stored the sentence somewhere careful. Back at the ranch, unloading in the cold, she found a moment alone with Elias near the barn. "What you did today," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was untacking the mare, and he spoke to the horse rather than to Clara, which was how he said difficult things. "In the square, with Mercer." "I held my ground," she said. "Anyone would have." "They wouldn't," he said. "Most people would have stepped back. He's good at making people step back." He finished with the tack and turned. "And what you said about the record keeping, the documentation. It's practical," she said. "You're good at practical." "I had to get good at it," she said. "I didn't have other options." He nodded slowly. There was something he wanted to say that he was working on finding the shape of. She could see it happening, the same rehearsal she'd seen in Thomas, though older and more patient. He didn't find it, or decided it wasn't the right time. "Thank you," he said, "for today." He went back inside with the harness. Clara stood in the cold yard for a moment. The ranch sat around her in the gray December light, the house with its smoke, the barn with Agnes inside, the east field dead and silver with frost, the wood-split logs in their growing pile by the north wall that told the story of Thomas's winter displacement activity. 5 children in various states of coming down from a difficult day. She thought about what Samuel had said, that she was going to stay. She hadn't meant to say it that definitively. She hadn't known, until she said it, how true it already was. That was the month things changed between the children and Clara, and it didn't happen as a single moment. It happened the way most important things happen, incrementally, invisibly, through the accumulation of small, ordinary moments that don't announce their significance while they're occurring. Thomas started saying goodnight when he went to bed. Peter started asking her questions. Not the factual questions he asked about everything, but specific questions. Questions that required her to have opinions. Questions that assumed she had interior life worth consulting. Samuel kept telling her things his mother had said, not as comparisons and not as reproaches, but because he was 10 and his mother was still the primary text through which he understood the world, and Clara was now someone he talked to enough that the reference came naturally. Caleb stopped narrating and started asking. There was a difference, she'd found, and the difference mattered. Narrating was performance. Asking was trust. May learned to find her hand in the dark. This happened the first time in mid-December, when Clara was up late with the fire and May appeared in the kitchen in her nightgown with the wide eyes of a child who'd woken from a bad dream. She didn't ask for anything. She just came and stood near the stove where Clara was sitting, and after a moment Clara held out her hand and May took it, and they sat like that by the fire until May's breathing evened out, and then they walked back to her room together and Clara tucked her in and stayed until she was asleep. It happened again 3 nights later, and then the week after. May didn't speak, but she found the hand in the dark, every time, with the certainty of someone who had learned exactly where to look. The last week of December brought its own complications. A letter arrived from a lawyer in the county seat, something to do with a land survey claim Mercer had filed, the details of which Clara couldn't parse fully because she didn't have access to the original deeds, but which was clearly connected to the water dispute Elias had described. She watched him read it at the kitchen table, and she watched his face go through several things, and she waited. "He's claiming the survey puts the creek boundary differently than I understood it," Elias said. "Does he have a surveyor's documentation?" "He says he does." "Then you need one too," Clara said, "an independent one, someone with no connection to Mercer. That costs money." "I know." She thought for a moment. "Write everything down tonight. Every observation you've made about the water levels. Every date. Go back as far as you can remember and write down what you remember. Then write down what you've seen in the past 2 months." She sat down across from him. "You can't fight him on his terms. You fight him on yours. Paper, dates, specifics, witnesses, if you can find them. Is there anyone else along that creek who might have noticed the same changes?" Elias was quiet, thinking. "Harding," he said. The Hardings have a small place 2 miles east. They share the same tributary. Then talk to Harding. He and I aren't... He paused. We've had words over the years, nothing serious, but we're not friends. You don't need to be friends, Claire said. You need a common problem and a common interest in solving it. Elias looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was low and the kitchen was warm, and outside the December wind was doing what December wind did on the plains, which was remind everything that it existed. Where did you learn to think like this? He said. She thought about it. I had a lot of time, she said, when I was expected to be quiet, to think about how things actually work, how people actually work. When you're not allowed to say much, you end up watching. He was quiet. Mercer is betting that you'll respond with anger and he can handle anger, she said. He's used to men who come at him straight. He's not prepared for someone who documents. He's not prepared for you, Elias said. She shook her head. He doesn't see me as something to prepare for. That's his mistake, Elias said. He said it plainly, without decoration. And then he got up and found paper and sat back down at the table and started writing. And Clara got up and refilled his coffee and sat down on her side of the table and helped him organize what he remembered into the kind of record that had dates and specifics and could be read by someone who hadn't been there. They worked for 2 hours. Outside, the wind moved across the plains and found no resistance, the way it always did, the way it would long after all of them were gone. But inside the kitchen of that low, solid house, by the light of a lamp burning down its last hour of oil, something was being built, document by document, sentence by sentence, 2 people on opposite sides of a table making a record of what was true. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, it didn't look like anything from the outside. But it was the beginning of the thing that would matter when mattered was what was needed. The record they built that December night grew into something over the following weeks. Elias added to it every time he checked the South Creek, dates, water levels described in terms he and Clara had agreed on, the width of the flow measured against a marked post he'd driven into the bank, the color of the water when it ran thin and silty from upstream interference. Clara kept the pages in order and made a second copy in her own hand, stored separately in the chest in the kitchen, because she'd learned from watching her father misplace every important document he'd ever had that a single copy of anything critical was the same as no copy at all. Harding turned out to be more useful than Elias had expected. He'd ridden over to the Harding place on a Thursday in early January, taking Thomas with him because Thomas was old enough to be useful in that kind of conversation, and because Elias had a sense, though he didn't articulate it, that Thomas needed to see how men handled disputes without their fists. James Harding was a lean, deliberate man in his late 50s who listened to everything Elias said without interrupting, and then went inside and came back out with his own set of observations. Not as organized as Clara's record, but consistent, going back further. He'd been watching the creek for 8 months. He'd noticed the changes in October and hadn't known what to make of them. When Elias showed him the documentation, Harding read it slowly and then looked up with the particular expression of a man who has been alone with a problem for a long time and has just discovered he isn't alone with it. I'll testify, Harding said. It may not come to that, Elias said. It will, Harding said. With Mercer, it always does. Elias came home and told Clara about it at the kitchen table while the boys were doing their lessons. Clara had organized a rudimentary school schedule that happened in the mornings, which Samuel had initially resisted and now participated in with a competitive energy directed primarily at Peter, which was not the spirit she'd intended, but produced results. And May was in the corner with her fabric, which had progressed over the weeks from formless folding into something that was beginning to resemble a small figure with discernible limbs. Harding said Mercer has done this before, Elias said. Not the water, other things. He files claims and then offers to settle them privately, usually in ways that benefit him substantially. He's using the legal system as a lever, Clara said. That's one way to describe it. Does the county have anyone worth bringing this to? A land commissioner? A magistrate? There's a district judge who comes through twice a year. Next visit is March. That gives us 2 months. It gives us 2 months, Elias agreed. She looked at him. He was tired in a way that had been building since December. Not the physical tiredness of ranch work, which he handled without complaint, but something deeper. The tiredness of a man who has been managing too many things alone for too long. She recognized it because she'd seen it in herself, in the months before Red Hollow, before the square. That particular depletion that comes not from any single large thing, but from the accumulated weight of small things carried without help. We have time, she said, and we have the record, and we have Harding. He nodded. Elias. He looked at her. It's going to be all right, she said. She said it carefully, not as a promise. She was too practical for promises she couldn't guarantee, but as an assessment. I don't say that about things I don't believe. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression that she catalogued and then carefully did not examine. I know you don't, he said. January was hard in the way that midwinter is hard on ranches. Not dramatic, not the acute crisis of May's fever or the confrontation with Mercer, but the grinding daily difficulty of keeping animals alive and children fed and the cold from winning. The south pasture fence took damage in a windstorm and needed repair in weather that made working outdoors a sustained exercise in misery. One of the horses threw a shoe and Elias had to make the 12-mile ride to Red Hollow and back in a single day, which he returned from looking like a man who had made his peace with the concept of suffering. 2 of the chickens died for reasons that remained unclear, which sent Samuel into a period of mournful scientific inquiry and Peter into a period of practical concern about egg supply. Thomas and Clara built a routine. It happened so gradually she wasn't sure when it started. But at some point in January, she noticed that Thomas was reliably appearing in the kitchen in the early morning, not before her, because she was always first, but shortly after, and doing things without being asked. He'd check the fire. He'd bring in wood if the pile inside was getting low. He didn't talk much during these parallel mornings, and she didn't require him to. They'd developed a particular kind of companionship that was comfortable precisely because it didn't demand anything. 2 people occupying the same space in the early dark. Doing what needed doing, not performing anything for each other. One morning in the 3rd week of January, he said, without preamble and without looking up from the wood he was stacking, "When I'm angry at you, it's not actually at you." She waited. I know it doesn't make it easier. When I'm cold or I say something wrong." He set down a log. "It's just that sometimes I look up, and you're there, and you're doing something she used to do. And it's wrong because it's not her, but it's also—" He stopped. "I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to explain it," Clara said. "I want to." She turned from the stove. "You're 14, and you lost your mother, and you're watching someone else stand in the kitchen where she stood. Of course it's complicated. Of course you feel it in ways that come out sideways sometimes." She held his gaze. "I've never once thought it was really about me," he breathed. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. He went back to the wood. She went back to the porridge. And that was that. Not resolved exactly, because these things don't resolve, they only get more livable, but said, which was its own kind of progress. The drought started in February. It came the way droughts come, which is not all at once, but in the absence of something expected. The February snows that usually fell on the plains and melted slowly into the ground to feed the spring didn't come. The sky stayed flat and pale, and the cold was dry rather than wet, and the creek that Elias had been monitoring ran lower than he'd ever recorded. He noted it in the documentation and Clara noted it in the copy, but they both understood that this was different from Mercer's upstream interference. This was weather, which didn't respond to legal argument. By March, the situation on the south pasture was serious. The grass that should have been greening under snowmelt was still dormant, and the animals that depended on the creek were having to be managed more carefully, rotated between water sources, brought in to drink from the well when the creek dropped too far. Elias was out before light every morning and back after dark, and he was losing weight in the way that working men lose weight during sustained difficulty, not dramatically but steadily, the body consuming what it had stored. The judge came through in the middle of March. Clara didn't go to Red Hollow for the hearing. It wasn't a formal trial, just a preliminary review, the judge looking at what Elias had brought and deciding whether there was grounds for a full proceeding. Elias took Thomas, who was old enough to be useful, and Harding came in from his place with his own papers. Claire stayed with the younger children and kept herself busy and tried not to spend the entire day counting the things that could go wrong. Peter found her in his garden in the afternoon, the kitchen garden that she'd been trying to prepare for spring planting, working the soil in the thin warmth of the March sun, getting her hands into the ground as a way of keeping herself from thinking too hard. "They'll be all right," Peter said. He said it with his characteristic directness, the data collection quality that turned sentimental in a crisis because all his data was pointing the same direction. "Yes," Clara said. "You don't sound sure." I'm doing the thing where you say the thing you want to be true so you can practice believing it, she said. Peter sat down on the low garden wall and considered this. Does it work? Sometimes. She turned the soil. Go check on Caleb, would you? He's been too quiet this afternoon. Elias and Thomas came back at dusk. She saw their faces when they came through the gate, and her first read was that it hadn't gone well. There was a tightness around Elias's mouth that she'd learned to read as controlled disappointment. But Thomas looked different. Thomas looked like someone who has seen something that has changed his understanding of how things work. The judge reviewed the documentation, Elias said, at the kitchen table, while Clara put food in front of them both. He said it's thorough. He paused. He said most men who come to him with land disputes can't demonstrate consistent record keeping. He said our case was more documented than anything he'd seen this term. Clara sat down. He's going to issue a temporary order on Mercer's water claim, Elias continued. It's not a full judgment. It means Mercer has to demonstrate his survey is legitimate before he can proceed, and in the meantime he can't take any action against our access. That's significant, Clara said. It's not finished, Elias cautioned. No, but it's not nothing. She looked at Thomas. What happened with you? Thomas looked slightly startled at being asked directly. The judge asked me questions, he said, about what I'd observed on the creek. And? I told him. A pause. He listened, like what I said mattered. It did matter, Clara said. Thomas looked at the table, then back at her. You prepared that record, he said. You organized it. Your father observed everything in it. I know, but you're the one who made it make sense. He said this carefully, the way he said everything that cost him something. I wanted to say that. I wanted you to know I know that. The silence after was the comfortable kind. Caleb, who had come in during the conversation and was sitting at the end of the table eating with the focus of someone who had been too quiet all afternoon and was now making up for it in food, looked up and said, Are we going to be okay? Elias looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. Yes, she said, but it's going to take work. It's always work, Caleb said, returning to his food. That's exactly right, Clara said. The drought deepened in April. The creek dropped to a level that Elias said he'd never seen in 10 years on the land, and the south pasture began to fail, the grass going brown and brittle, the soil cracking in the way that soil cracks when it's been asking for water for too long. He started making decisions about the livestock that were the kind of decisions men hate making, which animals could be sustained through what was coming, and which ones were a cost that couldn't be carried. He made them without talking about them much, because they were his to make. But she could see him carrying them. In April, Elias got sick. It came on over several days, which was in some ways worse than if it had come on suddenly. She watched him pushing past what his body was telling him with the single-minded stubbornness of a man who believes that stopping is a luxury. He was coughing by Wednesday and feverish by Friday, and by Saturday morning he couldn't get out of bed without the room tilting, which was when he finally stopped arguing with the situation. Thomas took over the morning chores without being asked. Clara noticed this and felt something that was beyond gratitude, felt the specific satisfaction of watching a person become more themselves under pressure, which was different from watching someone merely cope. Thomas worked without drama and without complaint, and checked in with Clara at midday in a way that was less a boy reporting to an adult and more two people managing a shared situation. She set up in Elias's room the way she'd set up in May's room in December. Different situation. Not a fever that needed breaking so much as a body that had run out of reserves and needed time. But the same principle. Keep the room warm. Keep water available. Don't let him push himself back into the work before he was ready, which required vigilance because Elias's relationship with rest was adversarial. The south fence, he said, the second day, trying to sit up. Thomas checked it this morning, Clara said. It's holding. The animals need to be moved to the north. Already done. He looked at her. Samuel and Peter moved them yesterday afternoon, she said. I told them what you'd been planning to do, and they did it. Samuel is 11. Samuel is a competent 11, Clara said. Stay down. He stayed down, but with the expression of a man who was staying down only because the room was still tilting when he tried to get up, not because he'd been convinced. May brought him water in the afternoons. She'd taken on this responsibility herself. Nobody had assigned it to her. and she carried it with a gravity that Clara recognized as a child, contributing to the thing that had been frightening her. May understood enough about fever, about sick adults, about what could happen to people in beds, that caring for Elias in this small way was the only response she had access to. She came, she brought water, she sat beside the bed for a few minutes with the scrap figure she'd been working on. It was clearly a figure now, recognizable as such. And then she left. On the third day, Elias watched May leave the room and then looked at the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "She's better," he said. "She's better," Clara agreed. "Since—" he paused, recalibrated. "Since you came." Clara didn't respond immediately. She was adjusting the blanket at the foot of the bed, giving herself something to do with her hands. "She found her way," Clara said. "I just tried not to push her in the wrong direction." "That's not nothing," Elias said. "With May, that's not a small thing. People pushed her, in the year after her mother. Well-meaning people who wanted her to talk and couldn't hide that they wanted it." He was quiet for a moment. "She'd go tighter every time." "She needed to know it was her choice," Clara said. "That nobody was waiting for her to perform something." He looked at her. "Is that what someone did for you? Once?" She thought about the neighbor woman who had come and sat during the worst of the pregnancies, who had asked nothing, who had simply been present. "Yes," she said. "Once." "Who?" "A woman named Ruth Caldwell. She lived 3 houses from where I was with Daniel." Clara smoothed the blanket that didn't need smoothing. "She came without being asked and stayed until it was over. She never talked about it afterward, never made it into something I owed her. That sounds like a good person." "She was the best person I knew," Clara said. "I've tried to remember how she did it." Elias was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You've been good at this." "I've made mistakes." "Everyone makes mistakes." He shifted carefully against the pillow. "I mean, all of it. The children. The record keeping. Today." A pause. "I brought you here because I needed help and because what was happening to you wasn't right. I didn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't expect this." "What did you expect?" She said it without accusation. "I don't know exactly. Someone who helped. Someone who was present, but not—" He moved his hand slightly, indicating something he didn't have words for. "Not this." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct, undefended look of a man who is sick and therefore past the energy required to be guarded. She looked away first. "Rest," she said. "Clara." "Elias." A pause. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. I don't say it enough." "You don't have to say it," she said. "You show it. That counts more." She went back to the kitchen and stood for a moment with her hands on the table and breathed. The soil cracked through April and into May. Elias was back on his feet by the 3rd week of April, thinner and more careful about his movements, but functional, and he looked at the south pasture one morning with the particular look of a man assessing damage and doing mathematics that don't add up. Clara stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "We're going to lose the spring crop," he said. "Yes." "The hay we put up won't last through the summer if this continues." "No." She looked at the dead field. "What do you have in savings?" He told her. It was less than she'd hoped and more than she'd feared. She turned it over in her mind the way she'd learned to turn practical problems. Not panicking, just mapping the shape of it. "The chickens," she said. "We can sell eggs if we manage them more carefully. I can take in mending from Red Hollow. Martha Colley mentioned, when I was there in December, that she knew 3 women who needed skilled alterations done. She'd noted it at the time and filed it away. That's income that doesn't depend on the land. You shouldn't have to—" "I'm not talking about should," Clara said. "I'm talking about what's available." He looked at her. "We manage this together," she said, "or we don't manage it. Those are the choices." "You keep saying we," he said. "I keep meaning it," she said. She went to Red Hollow the following week alone. The first time she'd gone alone since November, since the day in the square that had been the beginning of everything. She'd prepared for it. She'd done the practice, in the early mornings, of holding the steadiness she'd worked on and examining it for weak points. Martha Colley was behind her counter when Clara came in. The smile that flickered across her face had something calculating in it, as usual, and Clara let it exist without responding to it. I heard about Elias's water trouble, Martha said. It's being handled, Clara said. And the drought. Hard year for ranchers. For everyone, Clara said. I came because you mentioned in December that you had neighbors needing skilled alterations. I'm available if the need is still there. Martha looked at her for a moment. The calculation behind her eyes shifted, from the social calculation that had always been there to something more practical and less personal. Mrs. Hale down the street, Martha said finally. Her daughter's getting married in July. She's been looking for someone who can fit a dress. She paused. You do good work? I do careful work, Clara said. Which is better? Martha's mouth pulled at one corner. I'll tell her you came by. It was while she was leaving that she saw her father. Henry Whitmore was coming out of the saloon on the opposite side of the street. The way he came out of saloons, slightly sideways, with the adjusted center of gravity of a man who'd been inside a while. He saw her at roughly the same time she saw him. They looked at each other across the width of the street for a moment that had the quality of a gap between lightning and thunder. The thing had already happened, and the sound was only now catching up. He looked older. She noticed that with a kind of detachment that she examined even as she was experiencing it. He'd aged since November, or maybe she'd simply been looking at him differently then, and was seeing him clearly now. He was a small man, she realized, not in height, but in the sense that mattered. He looked away first. He didn't cross the street. He didn't speak to her. He walked in the other direction with the walk of someone pretending they're walking for a reason rather than retreating, and she watched him go and she waited for the thing to break in her chest the way it had broken in November when he'd pocketed the money and walked away without looking back. It didn't break. It had already broken. There wasn't enough of that particular thing left intact to break again. What was there instead was something quieter and more permanent. Not forgiveness, which was a thing people talked about as though it came in a single moment, but the ongoing daily act of choosing not to let what he was become the measure of what she was worth. She walked back to her horse and untied it and rode home. The green plant appeared at the end of May. She almost missed it. She'd been walking the south field in the early morning, part of the daily assessment she'd taken on, checking what was there and what wasn't, looking for anything that could be salvaged or repurposed. And she was near the eastern edge, where the soil had a slightly different quality, slightly more clay in it when she saw it. One plant, low to the ground, a pale, insistent green against the cracked and brown-gray of everything around it. She stood and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't much. It wasn't the field recovering. The field was still the field, still dead in the way that a month of missing rain made things dead. But it was there. Something had found enough in the ground to push through anyway, without invitation, without the conditions that should have been required. She went and got Elias. He came out with his coffee and stood beside her and looked at it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he crouched down and looked at it more closely, the way he looked at all things that needed to be assessed, carefully, without jumping to conclusions. It's a wheat seedling, he said, from last year's planting. Must have been deep enough in the soil that it... He straightened. It survived. Clara looked at it. We need to mark it, she said. Protect it. If it made it this far, it can go further. One plant, she agreed, and then we look for more. She did look for more. She went back out every morning for the next week, going over the east end of the south field methodically, and she found 11 more, scattered, nothing you could call a stand of wheat, but present, alive. She marked each one with a small stone circle, the way she'd seen done in a field her mother had once kept, and she irrigated them by hand from the well when the creek couldn't provide, carrying the water herself in the early morning before the heat made it evaporate too quickly. The boys helped. Thomas organized the system without being asked. He took a morning rotation with Peter and Samuel, and Caleb came when his shorter legs could keep up, and May once carried a small bucket the full length of the field with both hands and the gravity of someone performing a thing that mattered. They lost the south pasture entirely by June. But the 11 seedlings became 18, and then 23, and by the time July came with its full weight of heat, 23 small plants were growing at the eastern edge of what had been the worst of the dead field. And they were not a crop, and they were not a solution, and they were also, stubbornly and exactly, proof. It was Thomas who came to her on a July evening while she was on the porch, watching the sun go down over the brown plains, and said, with the careful voice he used when something mattered, I think you saved us. The rain will come eventually, Clara said. I don't mean the drought. He sat down on the step below her, which was the posture of a boy talking to a person he trusted, not a teenager performing independence. I mean, before the drought, last winter, the way things were before you came, they were. He stopped. We were managing. You said that. I said that. But managing isn't the same as living, Clara said. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. Dad smiles now. He didn't used to. Not really. He picked up a small stone from the step and turned it in his fingers. The same unconscious movement she'd seen in Caleb for months, and before that in herself. And May is May, Clara said. She was always going to find her way. She found it faster with you here, Thomas said. He set down the stone. I just wanted to say it. I've been bad at saying things. You've gotten better, Clara said. Have I? Considerably, she said. He didn't smile, so he was still a 14-year-old boy, and smiling at compliments was not in his available repertoire, but something around his eyes shifted, and he stayed on the step beside her while the sun went down, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. It was 2 days later, on a still July evening, when the air had finally given up some of its heat and the porch was bearable, that Elias sat down beside her after the children were in bed and looked at the dark field for a while. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. Not because of what I need, he said carefully. Not because of the children or the ranch or because it's practical. He was looking at the field, not at her, in the way he said difficult things. Because of what I know about you now. What I've seen, what it's like to... He stopped. Started differently. What I'm trying to say is that I don't want you here because you have nowhere else to go. I want you here because I'd rather be here with you than anywhere else without you. The field was very quiet. That's different from what you said in November, Clara said. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at the 23 plants in the dark, which she couldn't see from the porch but knew were there. I'm not easy, she said. I have opinions about everything. I'll reorganize things that don't need organizing, and I'll make decisions that should be yours to make, and I'll get it wrong sometimes, and I won't always know how to say so. I know, he said, and I'm... She stopped. What Daniel said about me, what my father thought, I'm not able to give you... I know, he said again, and his voice was firm, not dismissive, not breezy, not the voice of a man making a promise he hasn't thought through. The voice of a man who has thought it through all the way to the end and arrived at the same place. She looked at him. He was looking back at her now, and his face was the open, unguarded face of a man who is past pretending, past calculation, past the management of impression. Stay, Shay, he said. Not because you have to, because you want to. She thought about the cot in the kitchen where she'd started, the hairbrush, and the 37 cents, and the letter she'd never sent. The square in November, and the number her father had named, and the way the crowd had watched. She thought about Thomas on the porch step, and Caleb's riverstone, and Samuel's reluctant 2 feet, and Peter's questions and May's hand finding hers in the dark. She thought about 23 plants growing in a dead field because they'd found something in the ground worth reaching for. I already am staying, she said. I just needed to know you knew the difference between needing someone and wanting them. He nodded. They sat on the porch in the dark for a while, and the night settled around the ranch, and somewhere in the barn Agnes shifted in her stall, and the 23 plants stood in their stone circles in the east field, and the house behind them held 5 children sleeping the way children sleep when they feel, even unconsciously, that the ground beneath them is solid. The rain came in August, not all at once. Nothing that mattered ever came all at once, but in the way that relief comes after a long drought, which is tentatively at first, almost apologetic, as though the sky isn't sure it's welcome anymore. A week of light rain that softened the cracked earth without washing it away. Then a heavier system that moved through over 3 days and left the creek running at levels Elias hadn't seen since the previous October. He stood at the bank with his marked post and read the measurement and wrote it in the record, and came back to the house and told Clara the number, and she wrote it in the copy. It's not enough to recover the south pasture this season, he said. No, she agreed, but it's enough for next year. The 23 plants had become 31 by the time the rain came, and the rain pushed them forward with the particular urgency of living things that have been waiting longer than was comfortable. They were never going to be a crop that summer. The season was too far gone, the plants too late. But they were there, and they were real, and Elias said once, looking at them in the evening light after the second round of rain, that he'd put in a proper stand there next spring. Eastern section. See what the soil could do when it had what it needed. The hearing with the district judge came in September, by which point the documentation Clara and Elias had built was 3 months more comprehensive than it had been in March, and James Harding had added his own records to it in a folder he'd organized himself, which Elias reported was considerably better organized than his first set of observations. Clara had written a summary, 2 pages, plain language, dates and measurements, and the logical sequence of what had happened and why it mattered, and the judge read it twice. Mercer's surveyor turned out to have a history. That was the thing that broke it open, and it came not from legal maneuvering but from the unglamorous work of asking questions. Thomas, in one of the conversations he'd been having with Harding's oldest son when the two families crossed paths, had mentioned the surveyor's name. Harding's son had gone still and said he'd heard that name before, from a man in the next county who'd lost a boundary dispute 3 years ago, and the surveyor's name had been in the middle of it. It took 2 letters and 6 weeks to get the information back, but what came back was specific. The surveyor Mercer had used had been cited in that earlier case for submitting measurements that didn't match independent verification. Not proven fraud, the case had settled before it went that far, but a documented challenge to his methodology. Clara read the letter when it arrived and read it again, and then set it down carefully on the table. "This isn't proof that Mercer knew," she said. "No," Elias said, "but it's proof that his evidence isn't as solid as he's been presenting it." "Yes." "Take it to the judge," she said, "along with everything else. Let him decide what it means." What the judge decided was that Mercer's claim required independent resurvey before it could proceed, and that in the meantime the status quo was to be maintained, meaning Mercer could not take any action against the Crow Ranch's water access. It wasn't a final ruling. It wasn't victory exactly, and Clara was careful not to call it that. But Mercer's leverage, the thing he'd been using to make Elias feel the ground shifting under him, had been met with paperwork and patience and a 14-year-old boy asking the right question of the right person at the right time. Mercer didn't come to the ranch after that. He didn't approach Clara in town. He was still there. Still had his land, still had his disposition, still had the particular way certain men have of treating the world as a resource to be managed rather than a place to be shared. But he'd found that this particular family was not the kind that stayed quiet and waited for things to be decided for them, and that calculation had changed how he moved. It wasn't a triumphant reckoning. Clara had not expected one. Triumphant reckonings were for stories that wanted you to feel something large and clean, and real life, in her experience, rarely produced anything large and clean. What it produced instead was this: a family that could work its land without looking over its shoulder every morning, and a record in a county courthouse with both their names on it, and the specific satisfaction of having fought something real with something true. October came and changed the color of the plains, and with it came a question that Clara had been turning over since the evening on the porch in July. They hadn't spoken about that evening directly. Elias had said what he'd said, and she'd said what she'd said, and they'd sat together in the dark, and the following morning they'd both gotten up and started the day without ceremony, because ceremony wasn't how either of them handled important things. But the evening had changed the quality of everything that came after. Not dramatically, not in a way the children would have been able to point to, but in the particular way that honesty changes the air between two people once it's been spoken. They knew where they were. They'd stopped pretending they were somewhere else. Thomas figured it out first. Which was not surprising. Thomas noticed everything and processed it internally for weeks before responding, which meant that by the time he said anything about a thing, he had already finished being surprised by it and had arrived at something more considered. He came to Clara one morning while she was mending and said, with the careful directness he'd been developing all year, "Are you and Pa going to get married?" Clara looked at him. "That's a question I haven't answered yet." "But it's a question." "Yes," she said. "It's a question." He nodded slowly. "I just wanted to say—" He paused, tried again. "It wouldn't be— I don't think it would be wrong, if that's what you were thinking about." She put down the mending. "Thomas, I know she's not—" He stopped. "I know you're not her. I've known that for a long time. But I also know what this family was before you came and what it is now, and I know something moved in his jaw. She would have liked you, my mother. She didn't have patience for people who perform things. You don't perform anything. Clara held very still. That's the most important thing I know about you, Thomas said, that you don't perform. She didn't cry. She came close. Close enough that she had to do the thing she'd been doing since November, the steady internal calibration that kept her functional when things pressed in. But she didn't cry. Your mother sounds like she was someone worth knowing, Clara said. She was. He picked up his hat from the table. I'm going to help Pa with the fence. He left, and Clara sat with the mending in her lap and the morning light coming in through the kitchen window. And she thought about a 14-year-old boy who had spent a year compressing his grief into anger and then slowly, over the course of another year, finding better containers for it. She thought about what it cost him to say what he'd said. She thought about Agnes the horse and the barn at 3 a.m. and the first real conversation they'd had. She thought that he was going to be fine. Not easy. He was too much like his father, too much like herself, for anything to be easy. But fine. The kind of fine that takes work and produces something solid. The wedding happened in November, 1 year and 3 days after Elias had set money on a post in Red Hollow and changed both their lives. It was not a large event. The justice of the peace from the county seat rode out to the ranch because Clara had no interest in being married in Red Hollow, and Harding and his wife came because they'd become the closest thing to friends either Elias or Clara had in the surrounding territory, and the 5 children stood in the main room of the house in their best clothes and bore witness. May wore a dress she'd asked Clara to help her make. She'd brought the scrap of fabric she'd been working with all year, the small figure she'd been folding and refolding and eventually stitching into shape, and shown it to Clara with the manner of someone presenting a plan rather than a question. The figure was, Clara understood, a doll. Rough but intentional, with limbs that were recognizable as limbs, and a head that was round and deliberate. May wanted to make a proper dress for it, and she wanted Clara to teach her how. They'd spent 3 evenings working on it together. Clara had taught her the stitches, not all of them, just the ones that were manageable for small hands learning something new, and May had applied them with the same gravity she brought to everything, with the concentration of a child for whom precision was a form of respect for the work. The doll's dress was imperfect in the ways that first things are always imperfect, slightly uneven at the hem. One seam that had been taken twice because the first attempt puckered, but it was finished and it was real, and May had held it up when it was done and looked at it for a long time, and then looked at Clara with an expression that needed no words and had never needed them. On the morning of the wedding, while Clara was doing her hair in the small mirror she'd acquired in September, May came and stood beside her. Clara looked at her reflection, then at May's, and didn't say anything because nothing needed saying. May reached up and straightened a pin that was slightly off-center, and then met Clara's eyes in the mirror and nodded once, with enormous solemnity, as though confirming something they'd both already agreed to. Clara reached up and covered May's hand briefly with hers. Then she finished her hair and went to get married. The justice of the peace was a short man with an efficient manner who clearly regarded the ceremony as important business to be conducted properly, rather than an occasion for sentiment. Clara appreciated this. She and Elias stood in front of him in the main room of the house, with the children arranged in a rough line behind them, and the Hardings standing slightly to one side. And the words were said, and the acknowledgments were given, and at the end of it Elias took her hand in both of his in the way he did things, quietly, without performance, with the full weight of intention. And Clara looked at him and thought about the post with the money on it and the flat tone in which he'd said that what was happening was wrong and that sometimes things worked out even when they started wrong. She thought he'd been right about that. Samuel cried. This was not something anyone had anticipated, and Samuel himself appeared profoundly ambushed by it. He was crying and looking simultaneously offended at himself for crying, which made Peter put a hand on his shoulder with an expression of great patience, which was unusual enough in their dynamic that everyone who saw it would remember it. Caleb stood with his riverstone in his fist and watched everything with the wide recording attention of someone who understands that this is one of the things worth remembering. Thomas stood straight and didn't cry, but his jaw worked the way it worked when he was feeling things he wasn't going to talk about until he was ready, and Clara suspected he would be ready sometime in the next year, and that when he was, what he said would matter. After, there was food, more food than Clara usually made because she'd been cooking for 2 days and the Harding women had brought things as well. And the main room was warm and loud and imperfectly arranged and entirely alive with the specific noise of people who are actually together, not performing togetherness, but doing it badly and genuinely, which is the only way it counts. Harding sat next to Elias and talked about the spring planting, which was exactly what men like Harding did at significant occasions, and Elias received this as the comfortable thing it was. Clara talked with Harding's wife, who had seen things in this territory that Clara hadn't, and had opinions about everything from soil composition to the education of daughters, and Clara found her more interesting than she'd expected, which was something she was finding more frequently about more people, that when you stopped waiting for them to dismiss you, you could hear what they were actually saying. May fed her doll a small piece of bread. Caleb noticed and carefully did not comment, which was an act of social grace that Clara would not have predicted from him 6 months ago. The territory didn't stop being difficult because they'd gotten married. The Mercer situation required ongoing attention. The independent resurvey had been commissioned but would take months, and the documentation work continued because it would be needed when the final ruling came. The ranch still had the south pasture to recover, and debt from the drought summer to manage carefully, and livestock decisions that kept Elias up some nights running numbers in his head. Clara's mending work had grown. Mrs. Hale's daughter's wedding dress had led to 2 more commissions, and then word moved through the women's network of the territory. The way word moved in such networks, quietly and thoroughly, and by the end of November she had enough work to justify clearing a corner of the main room as a dedicated sewing space, which she did on a Saturday morning with Thomas's help moving furniture. "Where's this going?" Thomas asked, holding one end of a heavy cabinet. 2 feet to the left," Clara said. "Why?" "Light from the window," she said. "I need it to land on the work, not behind it." Thomas moved his end 2 feet to the left and looked at the result. "That's also better for the room in general," he said, with the manner of someone noting an objective fact. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." He set down his end. "You do that," he said. "You fix things and make them look like they were always that way." She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. He looked at the room. "No, it's—" He shook his head slightly, the way people shake their heads when language is being insufficient. "It's just something I noticed." She picked up the other piece. "Where's this one going?" "You tell me," he said. "You've already got it planned." She did have it planned. She moved it where it needed to go. Peter turned 13 in December, and the way he turned 13 was by becoming almost overnight a person with an interior life he hadn't previously been advertising. He still had the data collection quality, the scientific watchfulness, but it had deepened into something more genuinely philosophical. He started asking questions that had no clean answers, which Clara recognized as the beginning of something real. He asked her once why some people stayed kind when the world was unkind to them and other people didn't. She thought about it honestly. "I think it's partly what you were born with," she said. "Disposition, temperament. Some people have more access to it than others. And I think it's partly who you've been around, whether the people in your life showed you that kindness was survivable. Was it survivable for you?" She thought about Red Hollow, about the square, about the 37 cents and the hairbrush and the letter. "Not always," she said, "but I survived the times it wasn't." "How?" "By being stubborn," she said, "and practical, and by finding 1 or 2 people who showed me it was possible." He considered this. "Ruth Caldwell," he said. He'd heard her mention the name once, months ago, and filed it. "Ruth Caldwell," she confirmed. "And Pa," he said. "On the other side." She looked at him. "He showed you it was possible," Peter said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating an observed fact. "In the square. He showed you that there were people who saw things as wrong when they were wrong, and did something about it even when it was inconvenient." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He did." "I want to be like that," Peter said. Not fervently, not dramatically, just as information. An intention announced plainly, the way he announced everything. "You're on your way," Clara said. May spoke on a Tuesday in January. It didn't happen the way Clara had imagined it, in the time she'd allowed herself to imagine it at all. She'd always kept that imagining at arm's length, because wanting it too much seemed like the wrong kind of pressure to put on a thing that had to happen in its own time, or not at all. But she'd imagined it sometimes anyway. The way you imagine water when you're thirsty, not because imagining helps, but because the mind moves toward what it needs. It happened in the kitchen, early morning, Clara at the stove, May at the table with her doll, and a scrap of new fabric she was attempting to fashion into a second garment for it. The house was quiet. Elias was already outside, the boys still in their rooms in various states of approaching wakefulness. Just the two of them and the fire and the light coming in through the east window at the angle that Clara had arranged the sewing corner to capture. May had been struggling with a stitch. Clara had glanced over twice and seen the struggle but hadn't intervened. She'd learned to wait until she was asked, with May, because asking was the thing that mattered, the thing that said, "I trust you enough to need something from you." She heard May put down the fabric. She heard the specific silence of a child gathering something from a depth. And then May said, in a voice that was small and careful and slightly hoarse from long disuse, "Clara." Clara didn't turn right away. She gave herself 2 full seconds to absorb what had happened, to let it exist without her reaction collapsing it. And then she turned. May was looking at her with the large, serious eyes that had been watching her for 14 months. She had the doll in her left hand and the fabric in her right, and she looked exactly as she always looked, except that she had just spoken. "Yes," Clara said. She kept her voice ordinary. She kept everything ordinary, with an effort that she would not have been able to describe to anyone who hadn't loved a child who couldn't be pushed. "The stitch won't lie flat," May said. She had opinions. Clara had always suspected she had opinions. She'd been waiting, all this time, with specific opinions she'd been accumulating and not been able to share. "Come here," Clara said. "Let me show you." May got up from the table and brought the fabric to the stove and stood beside Clara. And Clara took the fabric and looked at the stitch and said, "You're pulling too tight when you pull through. You need to let the thread be a little easy." "Easy," May repeated, testing the word, checking its weight. "Easy," Clara confirmed. She showed her. May watched with the total concentration she brought to things. She tried it herself and it was better, not perfect. It wouldn't be perfect, first things never were, but better. "Better," May said. "Better," Clara agreed. They stood at the stove together, and Clara handed back the fabric, and May went back to the table, and neither of them made it into something larger than it was. It was large enough on its own. It didn't need any help. Clara went back to the porridge. She was stirring it when she heard the door and Elias came in from outside, stamping cold off his boots, and looked at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. "May spoke," Clara said. He was very still. "In the kitchen. Just now." Well, Clara kept her voice level, because if she didn't keep her voice level, she was going to do something embarrassing. She said the stitch wouldn't lie flat. Elias looked across the room at the kitchen table, where May was sewing with the total focus of a child doing something that matters. She had the doll propped against the sugar bowl where she could see it while she worked. He looked back at Clara. "I want to," he started. "Let her come to you," Clara said quietly. "She will, but let her come." He looked at his daughter again. Something moved through his face that Clara had only seen once before, in May's room in December, after the fever broke, in the first light coming in through the window. It was the look of a man who has been carrying something at the absolute edge of what he could carry and has just been told he can set it down. He went to the basin to wash his hands. He sat at the table. He poured his own coffee without looking at May, without performing not looking at May, just sitting and being present the way she'd taught him to be present. May sewed. After about 4 minutes, she looked up and said to her father, "Agnes was looking at me from the barn door this morning." Elias held very still. "What kind of look?" "Considering," May said. "She does that," Elias said. "Your mother always said Agnes had opinions." "I think she wanted to come inside," May said. "Agnes is not coming inside," Elias said. "I draw the line there." May looked back at her sewing. "I told her that," she said. "She didn't agree." The boys came down for breakfast one by one, and each of them, as the morning progressed, found their way to understanding that something had shifted, not through being told, but through the particular atmospheric change that happens in a household when a long-held tension finally releases. Samuel knew first, Because Samuel paid attention to Clara's face, and Clara's face was doing something it didn't usually do. He looked at May, and then back at Clara, and raised his eyebrows, and Clara gave a very small nod, and Samuel looked at his porridge and ate it with the expression of someone receiving good news in a context that required composure. Peter figured it out mathematically. He was listening to the ambient sound of breakfast, and there was a variable that hadn't been present before. And when he isolated it, he looked at May, and then did the thing he always did when he'd arrived at a conclusion, which was close his mouth and nod slightly to himself. Caleb noticed when May asked him to pass the bread. He passed it to her. Then he set down his stone and stared at her. "You talked," he said. "Caleb," Thomas said. "She talked," Caleb said, with the conviction of a person stating something that requires public acknowledgement. "Caleb," Thomas said again, with the tone of someone who understands that this moment is being handled carefully by the adults and does not need Caleb's editorial input. May looked at Caleb. "Yes," she said. Caleb picked his stone back up. He looked at it. He looked at May. He looked at Clara. He looked back at his porridge. "Okay," he said, and went back to eating. The final ruling on the water dispute came in February of the following year. The independent surveyor's report confirmed what the documentation had suggested, that the creek boundary ran exactly where Elias's original understanding had placed it, and that Mercer's claim was based on measurements that were, at minimum, imprecise, and at maximum, deliberately so. The judge's ruling was clear. Mercer had no legal basis for his claim and was ordered to cease any activity that interfered with the natural flow of the creek above the Crow property line. He was also ordered to pay a modest sum toward the survey costs, which was less satisfying as a number than as a principle. The letter came on a Thursday. Clara read it at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it with the documentation file and then sat for a moment. Elias came in from outside and she handed him the file open to the ruling page. He read it. He sat down. He read it again. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He set the file on the table. He looked at his hands. He had the look of a man who has been so long in the middle of a fight that winning it produces not exhilaration, but a kind of profound tiredness, the body finally acknowledging what it cost. "You built that case," he said. "We built it," Clara said. "Clara." "Elias, we built it. You had the observations. Harding had the history. Thomas had the right conversation with the right person. I organized it. None of it works without all of it." He was quiet. "That's the thing about this family," she said. "That's what I've been watching all year. It's not any one person. It's all of them. All of you." She looked at the window. "That's what Mercer never understood. He was looking at you alone and trying to find the weak point. He never figured out that the weak point doesn't work the same way when people are actually in it together." He reached across the table and covered her hand. They sat like that for a while, and the file was on the table between them, and outside the February light was thin and cold, and the creek was running at the level Elias had been documenting for 14 months, running exactly where it was supposed to run, carrying water down to the south pasture that was going to be planted in spring. Spring came, and the planting happened. The east section of the south pasture went in with the wheat that Clara had marked with stone circles the previous summer. It was more than 23 plants now. It was a proper stand prepared through the fall with the care that soil needs after a hard drought, worked with compost and timing and a respect for what the ground could and couldn't do in a single season. The whole family planted it. Elias and Thomas worked the rows while Clara and the younger boys managed the seed distribution with the methodical care that Clara had, over the course of a year and a half, transmitted by example rather than instruction. May planted a row by herself, working with the same gravity she brought to sowing, stitch by stitch, seed by seed, the knowledge that small, precise actions accumulate into something real. It was hard work, and it was muddy, and by the end of the first day everyone was tired in the bone-deep way of physical labor that matters. And that night at the table nobody had much energy for talking, which was its own kind of contentment. Caleb, in the middle of the quiet, said, "I think the field feels different." "Fields don't feel anything," Samuel said, with the weariness of someone who has been engaging with Caleb's observations for his entire life. "I know that," Caleb said. "I mean, it feels different to be in it." Nobody argued with this. Clara looked around the table at the 8 of them. She counted this way now, including herself and Elias in the number without thinking about it, which was a thing that had happened sometime in the fall without her noticing the moment. and thought about the night she'd lain on the cot in the kitchen and tried to catalog what she had. 37 cents, a hairbrush, a letter she'd never sent. She should write that letter, she thought, not to send it. She'd written it to herself and it needed no recipient. But she should finish it. She'd stopped in the middle of a sentence 3 years ago, in the worst of the grief, and left it unfinished because she didn't know how it ended. She knew how it ended now. There were businessmen who came in April. She hadn't been expecting them, but she also hadn't been surprised. The territory was changing. It was always changing, had been changing since before any of them were on it, and the kind of men who watched which way the land was going and moved to get in front of it had been increasingly visible in Red Hollow over the past year. These two arrived on a Thursday in a wagon that was too clean for the road they'd come on, with the particular combination of well-pressed clothing and approximate friendliness that Clara had learned to read as a negotiating posture rather than a genuine manner. They wanted the ranch. They presented it as an opportunity. Generous price, they said, more than the land was worth at current assessment. A chance to relocate somewhere with less drought risk, less isolation, better prospects. They said all of this to Elias at the kitchen table while Clara served coffee and stayed in the room, which one of them seemed mildly surprised by, and the other adjusted to faster. Elias listened to all of it. He had the quality, which Clara had first seen in him the day he'd set money on a post in Red Hollow, of listening to something completely before responding. Not as a negotiating tactic, but as a genuine inclination. He wanted to understand the whole thing before he answered any part of it. He looked at Clara when they were done. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. It wasn't her place to say it first. "No," Elias said. The men looked at each other. They tried another angle. A higher number, a different framing, the argument that the drought had shown the vulnerability of the land. "The drought showed me what this land could survive," Elias said. "That's not a reason to sell it. That's a reason to understand it better." One of them looked at Clara. It was the look that men sometimes turned on wives when they wanted to find a softer target, an alternative path. "Mrs. Crow," he said, "surely you can see the practical advantages of—" "My husband answered the question," Clara said. The man looked at her. "He said no," she said. "That's the answer." They left without their sale, which they did with the professional graciousness of men accustomed to being told no by people who would eventually come around. Clara watched them go from the kitchen window and felt no particular triumph. They were doing what they did. This family was doing what it did. Those were simply different things. Thomas, who had been in the barn during the visit and had come in just as the wagon was leaving, looked from his father to Clara. What did they want? "The ranch," Elias said. Thomas looked out the window at the disappearing wagon. "Good thing you have Ma," he said. He said it flatly, as fact. It was the first time he'd said it. Ma. He'd been working up to it for months. Clara had seen it in him, the way she saw most things in him, sideways, in the peripheral vision of paying attention. He'd been trying on the word in the privacy of his own mind, checking its weight, deciding whether it was the right container for the thing it was meant to hold. He went back to the barn. Clara stood in the kitchen and held the word in her chest and let it exist there for a moment before she went back to what she was doing. The sign at the edge of the property was Elias's idea, but Clara helped him make it. He wanted wood that would last, and they worked on it on 2 evenings at the barn workbench, Elias cutting and Clara smoothing, and both of them applying the letters with the careful deliberateness of people who understood that what they were writing was more than directions and less than a monument. Just a plain statement in plain letters that any traveler on the road could read. The Crow Ranch. Not for sale. They put it up on a Saturday in June with the whole family present, because these things should be witnessed by the people therefor. Elias drove the post, and Clara held it plumb while he worked, and the children stood in the morning light in various postures of attention. May had the doll, which accompanied her most places now, dressed in the second garment she'd made for it, the stitching considerably better than the first. When the sign was up, everyone looked at it. Caleb said, "It looks right." Nobody disagreed. Clara thought about what it had taken to get to a sign. Not the literal labor. That had been 2 evenings and a Saturday morning, but the actual price of it, the square in November, the cot in the kitchen, the 37 cents and the hairbrush and the letter she was going to finish writing, the burned porridge and the failed laundry and the bruise on Caleb's side that nobody had been telling anyone about. The fever in December and the documentation and the creek running where it was supposed to run, and the 23 plants that became 31 that became a field being planted in spring by 8 people who had not been a family 2 years ago and now were. None of it had been earned cleanly. None of it had come without cost. She was not the person she'd been in the square. Not better, exactly, because she wasn't sure that was the right word for it. Changed. She'd been changed by the same process that changes anything that survives a hard season. Not softened, not hardened, but restructured. The way soil restructures itself after drought and rain, closer to what it actually was, rather than what the surface had presented. She was, she thought, more herself than she had been since before the marriage to Daniel, since before the years of diminishment, since before she'd learned to make herself small enough to take up only the space she was allowed. She had not gotten there by being rescued. Though Elias's act in the square had been, in its way, a form of rescue, she was clear-eyed enough to know that. She had gotten there by the daily work of showing up and staying and doing the next thing, and refusing, when she had the choice, to make her smallness permanent. There was something she wanted to say about that, some way to articulate what she'd understood in the course of 20-plus months on this piece of frontier land. But she'd learned to distrust sentences that tried too hard to carry meaning, the truth about how a person recovers their worth, or whether worth was ever the right word for it. Maybe value, maybe simply the sense of being real and present and actual in the world. The truth about that didn't fit in a sentence. It fit in a record of dates and water measurements. It fit in a boy saying "ma" for the first time in a flat, factual voice that meant he'd finished deciding. It fit in a small hand covering yours in the dark, the certainty of someone who had learned exactly where to look. The crops came in that fall. Not abundantly. It was a first year on recovering ground, and first years on recovering ground are always cautious, always provisional. But they came in, and they were real, and they were enough. The letter Clara finished on a Thursday evening in October, after the children were in bed and Elias was doing the accounts, and the house was making its settling sounds, the familiar sounds she'd learned by feel over 2 years. She found the paper in the chest where she'd kept it and spread it on the kitchen table and read what she'd written in the middle of the worst of it 3 years ago in Daniel's house, in the hollow of her own diminishment. She'd stopped mid-sentence. I don't know what I am worth or whether... She picked up the pen. She thought for a moment. She wrote, That's the right question anymore. I think the question I was actually asking was whether there was a place that would hold me. There is. It took longer than it should have, and it wasn't where I expected it, and it didn't come the way I would have planned it. But it's here, and I'm in it, and I know what I'm worth the same way I know the field is real, because I've worked it with my hands, and it has worked me back, and something has grown that wasn't there before. She folded it. She put it back in the chest. She didn't send it because it had never been meant to be sent. It had been a letter to the version of herself who was sitting on a cold floor not knowing if surviving was possible, and that version of herself didn't need it mailed. She just needed to know the sentence was finished. Outside the window, the Crow Ranch sat in the October dark, solid and unspectacular and entirely itself. The sign at the edge of the property said what it said. The field had been turned and rested and was ready for spring. Agnes was in the barn with her opinions. The creek ran at the level Elias would measure in the morning and write in the record. And in the low, solid house with its drafts and its repaired wall and its sewing corner in the main room, 8 people slept, and the fire in the kitchen burned down to coals, and the quiet of the plains settled in around everything like something that had always been there, waiting for the right kind of life to move into it and stay.